So I want to introduce someone else before we introduce the keynote speaker, and that's Christian Marino. And many of you may be wondering, well, how did you get Andy Fastow to come to Canton, Ohio? And that's through our relationship with Christian Marino. And Christian represents Lockton Dunning, and he has been a good friend and colleague for more than 10 years. Christian is the Senior Vice President at Lockton Dunning Benefits in Dallas, Texas. He has more than 25 years of experience working with employers across the world to manage rising healthcare costs. He began his career with NMG Consultants and Actuaries. There, he helped implement some of the first consumer-driven health plans and employer wellness programs in South Africa, consulting with multinational corporations including McDonald's, Unilever, and Toyota. In 2011, Christian joined Lockton as Vice President and Partner, where he works with employers on their health and welfare plans and benefits strategy. He recently completed his MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. And to introduce our keynote speaker, please join me in welcoming Christian Marino.
Take this. I sound way more impressive on paper, huh? There was something. Christian Marino, you might be asking yourself, if I were you, maybe one or two questions. First, why am I telling a story to introduce Mr. Andy Fastow as opposed to reading his prearranged bio? Is it because I'm a fabulously humble health and welfare consultant standing in front of you? No, it is not. Is it because I now get to call Andy Fastow a friend of mine? Probably not. Or is it because I have a fantastically embarrassing story to kick off this session? That I do. I've told this story several times. It's been passed now like folklore around my workplace, my family. It's been a while since I've told it, although I did tell an abbreviated version last night. And so to give context for this presentation, I will tell you the story of how I met Mr. Andy Fastow, and this was roughly 8 years ago. And over the course of those 8 years, he's now become my friend. So I was fly fishing in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico. The lodge, I don't know, has a capacity of about 30 people, give or take. There's a lot of dead stuff all over the wall. It's one of those places, you know what I mean? Like a hunting lodge kind of a feel. And I was with a friend of mine. We were excited to fly fish. And I have two versions of me. There's work Christian, which is in front of you now. But this was the other version of Christian, what I call party Christian, vacation Christian, good time Christian. So we're having some drinks. And in order to understand what happens next, you need to understand two what I think are key principles about me. Number one, I am a narcissist. I'm extremely self-involved. I think about myself all of the time. Number two, I have low self-esteem. So when I think about myself negatively. The result of those two things, the alchemy that creates, is a constant need for validation powered by weapons-grade insecurity. So as I'm leaving the bar, I walked by an individual who was sitting looking at his phone, and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And the gentleman stopped, looked up at me, stared straight at me, looked right back down at his phone. No acknowledgement, no high fives, nothing. And as I'm walking to the restroom, I'm like, why doesn't he like me? Did I not say something funny enough? It had been a couple of hours since I'd last been validated or told I'm fantastic by anyone, and so I was struggling, I'm not gonna lie to you. This shook my foundation that he could not say hello to me and acknowledge my awesomeness. So we come back and they sit us down for dinner, and they just kind of put you around a table, and lo and behold, I sit right across from the gentleman whom I assumed had insulted me by not complimenting me, which again, I've seen my therapist about this issue for years. I'm upset, and to my left on the table is his son, whom I get introduced to in a few moments. And on the other side of the table are maybe, and I'm not saying anything ageist here, I'm not lying when I tell you or exaggerating that the oldest people alive on the planet were sitting at our table, which is only relevant because they couldn't hear anything and didn't say anything. So now I have to talk to the gentleman across the table from me. How are you? Good, how are you? We exchange niceties. What do you do for a living? What do I do for a living? I tell him, and I said, are you all here for the fly fishing or the hunting? Because it's both. He said, no, we're here for the fly fishing. This is my son. He's here from college. We're very excited to fly fish. And I said, I was still upset about this thing that he did where he spited me. So I said, well, where'd you go to college? He goes, Dartmouth. I said, I don't know, I've never heard of it. What is that, like a trade school or something? I don't understand. He says, now you should see the tuition bill. So now I'm in. He's getting my humor. We're rolling. I said, you said before you did for a living, you're a speaker? He said, yeah, I'm a public speaker. I said, that's interesting. I do a lot of public speaking myself, albeit on healthcare employee benefits. What do you talk about? He said, I speak on business ethics. So now in my line of work, right, my job is to meet people, build relationships over time. Now I'm starting to go, well, maybe this is somebody I really want to know. I said, well, who do you talk to? And he said, yeah, boards of directors, forensic accountants, legislators, auditors. And I'm like, this is great. What are the odds? There's 20 people here. I'm sitting across from someone whom I might want to know for my career. So now I want to impress him. So I start talking about what I talk about. I talk about, fancy words like fiduciary and ERISA. That's exciting and maybe in this room, but to no one else. And he asked me a couple more questions, and I decide I want to pivot to sound intelligent, which I am largely not. But I decided in order to sound smart, I asked him one more follow-up question about his speaking. I said, you talk about business ethics. Dig down in that. That's broad. What do you talk about specifically? He says, I talk about the difference between what's right and what's legal and the gray area between those two things, and how confusing it can be when you're in the gray for those making the decisions. In order to sound intelligent, I say the following in return. I said, that's interesting. If you go back in time, you've got WorldCom, right? You've got Enron. All of those people thought what they were doing was either right or legal, but certainly not both. And I said, except for Andy Fastow, he was kind of a jack and should have gone to prison. Am I right or am I right? And the gentleman across from me pushes his dishes forward and leans in and says, I'm Andy Fastow. And I said, no, you're not. I've seen all the documentaries. I've read the books. You're not Andy Fastow. And he goes, get up, walk down the hall, third door on your left. It's my name badge. And as I'm looking at him, I'm like, he does look like a slightly older, maybe thinner version. But to this point, I get up, I walk down the hall, there it is. And as I'm coming back, I'm thinking, I've just insulted the most vilified, arguably infamous criminal CFO of a lifetime. To his face, in front of his own son. Maybe he'll let me slide. Maybe he's not going to say anything. And I'm panicking, I'm sweating, I keep thinking about the documentary. I'm like, I can't, what are the odds? There's only 20 people here. So I sit down and I said, Andy, I'm going to have to owe you the 100 because I don't have my wallet on me. And he said, that's okay, Christian. I'll tell you, I spent 7 years in a federal prison, but it still really ticks me off when people rake me over the coals in front of my kids. And I go, yeah, I would imagine that it would, Andy. And I'm still getting to figure out what's getting. All of a sudden, the old people wake up next to us, decide to chime in, and they say, well, what are you guys talking about down there? And I go, nothing. And Andy goes, I am Andy Fastow from Enron. And the old woman starts shouting, how do you sleep at night? And I'm like, I can't get out of this. So I try to tell a joke, which doesn't land. I said, listen, look at the bright side, Andy. Your son will have a really good story for his business ethics class at Dartmouth. It doesn't land. I leave the table and drop the mic. About a month later, I sent him a note on LinkedIn. I was, to say empathic, because I said what I said in front of his son doesn't do it justice. So I said I just wanted to say in writing how sorry I am and embarrassed I was that I said that in front of your son. Really, it just tore me apart. Had someone said something like that in front of my kid, that would have been tough. His response was even better. His response said, Christian, I meant it when I said don't worry about it. Thank you for the note. P.S. Ordinarily, people are mean to me after they find out who I am, not before. And I said, okay, well, great. So he invited us at Lockton to hear him speak. This was some time ago. We heard him speak. What I can tell you is, hopefully what you'll take from this is just that, what it's like in the gray. and how difficult it can be when you're living in that moment as decision makers. I know we've heard him talk at Lockton and have taken a lot of lessons from this. And over the years, having done this just a couple of times, Andy and I, as I've said, have become friends. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Andy Fastow to stage, please.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, I think. I can tell you that it was much worse than what he said. You were very kind to yourself. But thank you for the introduction. And, you know, it's just one of those things that goes to prove there are silver linings in everything if you could find them. And I value our friendship greatly. So, okay, well, thank you for having me here. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me. I'm always a little surprised when anyone invites me anywhere, but especially to talk about business ethics. I think inviting me to talk about business ethics it's like inviting Kim Kardashian to talk about chastity. I'm not really the right person for that. But all kidding aside, there's only one reason I'm here today. The only reason I'm here today is because I went to prison. When I was CFO of Enron was the 7th largest company by revenues in America. I was never invited to speak anywhere, not one time. Now I'm invited to speak somewhere around the world every week if I wanted to do it. But it's only because I went to prison. That's my distinction. It's an awful distinction to have. It's something I'm ashamed of and embarrassed about every day of my life. Something I think about every day of my life. Before I get going, I'd like to make one thing absolutely clear. And if you remember just one thing from this session today, I hope this is what you remember. I believe that what I did was wrong. I believe that what I did was unethical, and I believe that what I did was illegal. I take full responsibility for my actions. And in fact, I consider myself probably the person most responsible for Enron's failure. So I own that. You won't hear anything from me today that tries to minimize what I did or blame other people or shift blame in any way. And if you do, please stop me and let's talk about that. There may be people here who were harmed by what happened at Enron, harmed by my actions. And if there are, I apologize to you. I don't expect anyone to accept an apology from me, but I think everyone deserves to hear it. Okay, so with that, let's get on with things. Okay. Before I get going, a few quick administrative things. So first of all, this is my real cell phone number. So we're going to have time for Q&A today, but usually we run out of time during Q&A. I invite you to text me any questions you have later on. As far as questions go, nothing's off limits. Please ask me what you're really thinking. I will not be offended or insulted by any of your questions. If there's a question I don't want to answer, I'll just say so, but it won't be offensive to me. It's interesting because sometimes I'll get a text from someone 3, 4, 5 years after they've seen my talk, and they'll text me, you know, I'm in a situation and I thought about you. And usually my response is, well, probably you know the answer to your question already then. Please feel free to take a picture of that number, write it down, and the other reason I put it up there is because I'm still looking for a good job, so anyone has it. Okay, one other administrative thing. I am going to use the words he, him, guys throughout my presentation. Please accept that I mean that as an all-inclusive, gender-neutral, those terms. So it's meant to include everyone. All right. What am I going to talk about today? This isn't really a talk about Enron per se. If you want to read about Enron, and I'm sure many of you have, there's plenty you could read about Enron. What I thought would be more valuable than recounting a history of Enron would be instead to focus on how my brain was working when I was CFO of Enron. I mean, how did I make the decision to do the things I did? I mean, when Enron was imploding, even my family and friends would look at me and they'd say, you know, how'd you sleep at night? How'd you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning? What were you doing, Andy? I want to take you through how my brain was working, how I was perceiving risk, pricing risk, managing risk, because while I might be the most egregious example of this way of thinking, I believe it's very common. And I believe it's a common thread that you see in almost all corporate disasters, from Enron to the financial crisis to GE and Boeing and Silicon Valley Bank today. It's this way of thinking. And so, if anything, what I want to do is by putting you inside my brain, it's not meant to say this is an acceptable way to think, but just the opposite. It's meant to set an alarm, if you will, on the back of your brain. So when you encounter a person that you might be doing a deal with, or someone you're working with, or maybe even hear yourself sounding a little bit like me, that alarm will go off and you'll stop and pause. So that's the intent today, to put you inside my brain in the year 2000. How was I doing what I did? And I'm going to start off by saying something that should make you incredulous. Never once when I was CFO of Enron did it even occur to me that I might be breaking the law. Never once did it occur to me that I might be doing something unethical. And I considered myself a very ethical person. So again, by saying that, I'm going to pause one more time and say this. By saying that, in no way is that making an excuse for what I did. If anything, it further indicts me for having the lack of knowledge, the lack of character to understand that what I was doing was wrong, for not seeing it. So again, this is meant to be a cautionary tale and to hopefully set an alarm in the back of your head. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to the year 2000 because again, the objective today is to put you inside my brain. In the year 2000, I know how the story's been written about Enron. It was a fake company. It was a house of cards. Back in the year 2000, Enron was one of the most admired companies, and it really did have a significant amount of value. And if you were to look at Enron back in the year 2000, this is what you would have seen. It was the largest pipeline system, the largest trader of both natural gas and electricity, and each of those commodity markets is larger than the oil market. It was the largest wind power company in the world. It was the largest developer of international independent power projects in the world. And most of you probably don't remember this, but Enron was actually the first company to successfully live stream video on the internet. Back in the year 2000, we were actually trying to put together a joint venture with Blockbuster to live stream all of their videos. Unfortunately, both Enron and Blockbuster went bankrupt. Otherwise, today you would have called that Netflix. We had $100 billion in revenue, $1 billion of net income. Fortune magazine had named us the most innovative company in America for 6 consecutive years. There's only one other company with that distinction, Apple Computer. I mean, literally, it was the place to be. Ironically, in the year 2000, CFO magazine named me CFO of the Year. And I brought this to show you. This is actually my trophy from CFO magazine. It's kind of fallen apart. It used to have a star on top that fell off. Now it's just giving me the finger. The interesting thing about this trophy is that it was given to me for doing what's referred to as financial engineering. Doing finance transactions or accounting-related transactions that make your financial statements look better than they really are. The interesting thing about that is if you follow all the rules, it's perfectly legal. And I imagine, please don't raise your hand, some of the companies that you work for in this room do similar types of transactions. They're not uncommon. The interesting thing about these transactions is that on the one hand, they're perfectly legal if you follow the rules, but on the other hand, they're misleading. And we like to think of things as black and white. You know, this is the right answer. If you've ever taken an accounting course, you know you're thinking debits and credits. As long as the balance is at the end, you can close the books and get an A on your test, right? In the real world, it's very gray. You can do things where you're following the rules, but you can be misleading at the same time. And in essence, that's what I did when I was at Enron. I did transaction after transaction, where I was technically following the rules, but it was making the company financial statements misleading. And I did so many of those transactions that I made a company that was weak financially look like it was investment grade. And ultimately, that's wrong. It's going to be a little tricky to have this discussion, right? Because we like black and white things, clear-cut answers. This is right, this is wrong. What I'm going to talk about today is that gray area where you might be following the rules, but it may not be the right thing to do. And that's where we were in the year 2000, and everything was great. People loved us. The company was worth about $70 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot in today's market, but back in the year 2000, that was a very valuable company. But moving ahead just 8 months to August 2001, Enron's CEO unexpectedly resigned. The Wall Street Journal began to run critical articles about us. Okay, sorry. The Wall Street Journal began to run critical articles about us. Because of those articles, the SEC opened up an investigation and Enron declared bankruptcy. That all happened in 4 months. Enron went from being the 7th largest company by revenues to bankrupt in 4 months. I mean, people ask me, what was that death spiral like? There was no spiral. It was like a plunge off a cliff. It happened so quickly. About 2.5 years after the bankruptcy, I decided to plead guilty. I pled guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud, agreed to forfeit almost all of my assets, and served 10 years in prison. And I got this. This is my actual prison identification card. Every inmate in a federal prison has to carry this around with them in prison. It was a little disconcerting. When I was leaving prison, the guard actually handed it to me and said, hold on to this, you can use it when you come back, you'll have the same number. Unfortunately, I guess no one will hire me, so that hasn't happened yet. Okay, let me get back to what I want to talk about today. I got both of these for doing the same deal. How is that possible? How is it possible to be CFO of the year and go to federal prison doing the same deals? How is it possible to be CFO of the year and commit what many say is the greatest fraud in corporate American history, doing the same deals? I'll make it even a little more difficult for you, and I will tell you that every deal I did was approved by Enron's accountants, by the outside accountants, by Enron's attorneys, by the outside attorneys, and by the board of directors. And no information was withheld. How's that possible? How's it possible to have all those dates approving all of your deals? More important, how's it possible to have all those really smart and ethical people approving all of your deals, and yet you're committing fraud and you go to prison? That's what I want to talk about today. If I had to sum it up in one word, this is the word I'd use to sum it up. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I'd use the word loophole. Okay, quick show of hands. How many people here think a loophole is a bad word, a pejorative? 1? Okay, 2, 1.5. Okay, that's interesting. The definition of a loophole means that you are technically following the rules, but that you're intentionally trying to get around the purpose of those rules. Okay. Whoop, back up. If I'd asked the question in a different manner, I might have gotten a different answer. Let's say you go home this evening and you're having dinner with your family and your children are around the table, and your clever child says to you, hey mom, hey dad, I've got a question for you. You've given me a bunch of rules I have to live by in this house. And I understand all the rules, but I just want to make sure that as long as I technically follow the rules, if I get around the reason for that rule, you won't punish me. I suspect that would precipitate a conversation about character, about reputation, about risk, about what you want to get out of life, what kind of life you want to lead. Why is it that we have such a fundamentally different answer to that question in business versus our personal lives or with our children? It's because our brains are trained in a rules-based society to find every way to exploit the rules to our benefit. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when we're in a personal situation with our children, we think about the risk associated with those decisions differently than we think about the risk associated with those decisions in a business environment. In a business environment, what happens is our brains hear that we're technically allowed to do something, and we go. And we don't stop to think of those risks, or at least I didn't stop to think of those risks. And I think you'll find that as the common thread in all of these corporate disasters. Now, how could all of those people approve the deals? Because our advisors, our attorneys, our accountants, other advisors are paid to do only one thing. They're paid to tell us whether we're technically following rules. That's it. In the case of Enron, the attorneys and the accountants did exactly their job, and they were brilliant at it, and they were good. They did nothing wrong. They were paid to tell us whether we followed rules. And if we didn't follow the rules, to help us find a way to make sure we were following the rules. They did exactly what they're supposed to do. I'm the guy who failed. Because after they said, yes, you are following the rules, I didn't ask the most important question. Would a reasonable person under normal circumstances behave this way? It was that simple. I didn't ask that. That's the type of question you would ask your children if you were talking about loopholes. But it's not the type of question we normally ask in business. It's because our brains are programmed. We know the answer we want in business, right? We know on January 2nd exactly what the answer is at the end of every quarter that year. And it's our job to go find the way to get to that answer, right? Your boss doesn't say to you, okay, just do your best, and wherever we get by the end of the year, that's okay. Everyone will get a bonus. You know the answer. And you're expected to get creative in finding ways to get there, right? Push the edge of the envelope, create a new paradigm, think outside the box, be aggressive. Those are all terms we hear. No one's ever bought a book that's called Think Inside the Box, right? Right? We think outside the box, and we push the edge of the envelope. And that's a good thing, right? It helps us innovate, helps us become more profitable, find new technologies, make new advances. It's a great thing. But in doing so, our brains, when they hear the phrase, it's been approved, the accountants have said it's okay, the auditors signed off, the attorneys signed off, we often fail to ask that next question. Because we think, if it's approved by these people, what could go wrong? I'm safe, my company's safe. And I'm the poster boy to show you that that's not the case. So it's interesting because Enron has been portrayed as a compliance failure. A bunch of people who weren't following the rules, who are intentionally breaking the rules. And there are some corporate disasters that fall into this category. WorldCom, Bernie Madoff, things like that. Enron's a more difficult and subtle situation than most people think. It was a case where the culture was to follow the rules, but then to exploit the rules as much as possible to your advantage. We never did a deal that wasn't signed off on by all the experts, and we had some of the best experts in the world. But I never asked that next question, would a reasonable person behave this way? Would a reasonable person present financial statements that might be technically correct, but that are completely misleading? And it wasn't until much later that I learned the answer to that question was simply no. I'm going to show you real quickly a few examples of how some famous people think about rules, because what I'm really talking about here is following the rules versus following the principles. Okay? I only followed the rules. Most of you probably know who this is if you're a football fan. This is Bill Belichick. Most people consider him one of the best football coaches in NFL history. And I saw an interview several years ago, and he was asked kind of, what's your secret sauce? And it was really interesting because I expected him to talk about something football related. You know, we have the best recruiting, or we have the best offensive schemes or defensive strategies or player conditioning. He didn't talk about any of that. He said, there's only one way I've been able to differentiate myself among the coaches. He said, the top coaches are so closely matched in their abilities, like top CEOs, and the top companies are so closely matched in their abilities, like the top teams, that the only way he could find to differentiate himself was to understand the rules better than anyone else and to use that to his advantage. Look at what he said. In the rule book, there are secrets waiting to be mined. He finds the obscure rule he could use to his advantage. He looks at the rule book as a useful tool. And the reason I use this example is because when I read this interview, I was stunned, because that's exactly how I talked in the year 2000. This is what I'd say. Look, everyone gets the accounting rules, everyone gets the tax rules, everyone gets the securities laws. Whichever CFO can best exploit those rules gives his company a competitive advantage, and that company wins. And make no mistake about it, I wanted to make my company win. I wanted to be the hero. And as long as everything's going well, exploiting the rules looks like a great thing, and you get trophies and you get awards for it. But if something goes wrong, everyone gets to come back and look at those decisions through a different lens. Let me show you one example where it didn't work out so well. And I'm going to ask your forbearance here. I'm going to use a political example. And I know politics is really touchy these days. So I'm going to ask, is it okay? Can everyone just take like a 2-minute timeout from politics? I'm not trying to make a political statement here or anything. Okay. So, because politicians are the worst examples of rules versus principles. So I'm going to show you some quotes from one of the most famous politicians in the world. Like almost everyone in the world knows who this person is. Next slide, please. Okay. This is what this politician said. You get to use the rules. It was not prohibited. It was not in any way disallowed. I fully complied with every rule that I was governed by. Anyone want to guess who said this? Trump? No, these are complete sentences. Sorry, I just said I wouldn't do that. It was actually Hillary Clinton. Okay, I called this slide the reason why Donald Trump became president, rules versus principles edition. If you remember back to the 2016 election, you remember how close it was. It was really just a few thousand votes in a few states swung that election. And there are a lot of theories about why Donald Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost, but almost all the analysts agree if Hillary Clinton had not had that email scandal right before the election, she would have become president. These are all quotes in the 2 days following the discovery of that email scandal. Okay? And here's why I put them up there. I think they're all true statements. I don't know, but I think they are. And the reason I think they are is because whatever one's politics, have to have a great deal of respect for Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton. I mean, she was a U.S. Senator, she's an attorney, she's a U.S. Senator, she was Secretary of State of the United States. She's a smart person. She is smart enough to know that you do not take classified State Department emails, transfer them to your unsecured home server, unless someone has told you you can do it. And there's a giveaway up here. Look at this phrase. It was not in any way disallowed. Human beings don't talk like that. Attorneys talk like that. Sorry, Chris. This tells me she has an opinion. Not a clean opinion, probably, but a qualified opinion, probably from a top DC attorney, that tells her that he could find no explicit reason that she could not do it. It was not disallowed under the law. So she did it. Her starting point in her brain was she wanted to get it done. That's your quarterly target. And she found a creative way to get there. She got the opinion from the outside attorney saying she could do it. So she did it. In her brain, she was probably thinking, there's no risk here. I've got an opinion. If anyone comes back and questions it, I'll just show them the opinion. It's legal, or it's not illegal at least. What's really interesting, though, is that's not what happened. When the world found out about it, she was interviewed, and she kept getting asked questions about it. And I went back on YouTube and looked at interview after interview. She kept repeating these phrases. These were her talking points. Not once did the interviewer ever ask her the follow-up question, really, can you explain the rules to me? That's interesting. Can we see the opinion? And then we'll let it go. The follow-up question was always something like, did you jeopardize national security? Did you out a spy? If a younger person at the State Department had done this, would he be in prison right now? The follow-up question was never about the rules. It was always the reasonable person question. Would a reasonable person under normal circumstances have done this? And she couldn't answer that question, just like I couldn't answer that question. You know, for 2.5 years after Enron imploded, I planned to go to trial. Because in my head, I had done nothing wrong. I mean, I had the documents that showed everything was approved. So how could they even be charging me? It didn't make sense to me. And we were getting close to trial. So I sat down with my legal team and I said to my lead attorney, how are you going to convince a jury that I'm innocent? He said, well, Andy, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a big table in front of the jury. And on that table, I'll put a stack of documents, one for each deal that you did. So there'd be, you know, over 100 stacks of documents. Said then I'm going to walk down one by one and say the exact same thing. I'm going to point at each pile and say, in this pile of documents is the memo from Enron's accountants, the opinion from the outside auditor, the memo from Enron's attorneys, the illegal opinion from the outside attorneys, the company presentation, the approval note sheet, and the minutes of the board of directors meeting. You may not like it, but this deal is right. He would have said that about every pile, and it wouldn't have been unreasonable for him to say that. It was true. I said, well, what's the prosecutor going to do then? He said, well, the prosecutor will put you on the stand, and he's going to say, Mr. Fastow, are these deals right? And I'd say, sure, they're right. Look, all the documents are there. No, are they right? I'd say, well, look, I'm not an attorney. I'm not an accountant. I had very good advisors. I believe they gave me good advice, so I believe these deals are right. He'd say, no, I'm asking you a fundamentally different question. Were these deals the right thing to do? Or were you being intentionally misleading? There's only one way I could have answered that question. I absolutely was being intentionally misleading. Make no mistake about it. I was trying to be misleading. I saw that as my job, and I was good at it. And I was proud of it. You know, I would have said, look, if you don't like it, don't blame me, fix the rules. So my rhetorical question for you is, if that jury goes back to deliberate, are they going to say, well, that Fastow, he's a good guy. He followed all the rules. After $40 billion of shareholder values lost, after thousands of people have lost their jobs and their health care and their homes, after businesses that were working with Enron have been devastated, would they come back and say he followed the rules, that's okay? No, they would have come back and simply said, shame on you. It doesn't matter what the rules said. You knew what you were doing was wrong. You're going to prison for the rest of your life. That's one of the reasons I pled guilty, because they would have asked the reasonable person question that I never asked. Okay, I'm going to use one example, which I think is an interesting example of the gray area, and it's not finance or accounting, but everyone is familiar with this company, so I thought I'd use this today. I'm sure you all know Boeing is the largest aerospace company in the world. When you fly, you're more likely than not fly on one of their jets. But a few years ago, they had a very serious problem. 2 of their 737 MAX planes crashed, right? And around 360 people were killed in those crashes. It was devastating on a personal level to those families, but also for the company. And the interesting thing was, when that happened, there were a lot of people that immediately started investigating. Congress started investigating, the prosecutors began investigating, and ultimately 2 employees of Boeing were charged with essentially murder. for killing those people because they put planes into service that may not have been as safe as other planes. Now, here's the thing to think about. When we get on a plane, we don't think about safety because they're so safe, right? But there's a spectrum of safety. Think of it as the gray area in aviation. On one end of the spectrum, we have the technology, Boeing has a technology to build a plane that'll essentially never crash. They could build in so many redundant systems that it would never crash. But if they built that plane, it would be too expensive and no one would buy it and use it. So they don't build that plane. On the other end of the spectrum is the minimum required by the government, the FAA, to put a plane into service. But there's room in that spectrum. When we get on a regular 737, it's way out here. It's very safe. No one even thinks about it anymore, as long as they're maintained properly. The 737 MAX was less safe, but it was more safe than the minimum requirements. So they put a plane into service that they knew wasn't as safe, but it met all the requirements. Is that ethical? Is that unethical? I don't know. They could have made it more safe than the 737, but then they'd be less profitable and maybe no one would buy the plane. That's a tough decision, isn't it? Maybe it's the same in the medical industry. Sometimes there are drugs that might be more safe or less safe, but if they meet FDA requirements, they can be sold. There's some procedures that fall into that category, right? This is a similar decision to ones that people in the medical industry have to make on a regular basis. Now, please move the slide forward. So these two people were prosecuted, and then while they were being prosecuted, the Congress did an investigation. And this is what they found, that what Boeing did was compliant. They followed the FAA rules, but at the same time, it was not safe. Sounds similar to, I technically followed accounting rules, but my financial statements were misleading. Now, ultimately, what's interesting is those two people were acquitted at trial. But, next slide, please. There was another trial that took place. The market had a trial of Boeing. Boeing's stock after the 737 crashes dropped by 85%. It's one of the most important companies in America. Its value dropped by 85%. What's really interesting about this drop is that this drop, the value of this drop, far exceeded the entire value of the 737 MAX business. Literally, if they had just shut down the 737 MAX business, it wouldn't come close to accounting for this fall. So what was going on in the market? What were they thinking? Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite quotes from Warren Buffett. He has, I think, the best business quotes, but this is my favorite. There's never just one cockroach in the kitchen. You know when you find that one cockroach and it's on its back, its legs are twitching, and you kind of grimace and flush it down the toilet, and you stop thinking about it? If one made it into your kitchen, it means there are 1,000 behind the wall that you're not seeing, right? But we don't think about that. What he's saying is when you see a company make a decision like this, they're probably making other decisions like that, and we just haven't discovered them yet. There's a culture of making those decisions. And the same was true at Enron. If we would make a decision like publish financial statements that were misleading, we're probably doing some other things that were misleading, or maybe even worse. And the market will not forgive you for that. They're going to assume the worst. So it only takes one of these bad decisions. Next slide, please. Okay, now, I thought I'd do something fun this morning. I'm not sure you'll think it's fun, but one of the biggest problems I have when I give a talk is that people listen and they, based on the feedback I get, they understand what I'm saying, but no one really believes this can happen to them. No one believes they can make a bad decision or something that's viewed as unethical? Raise your hands if you think you're unethical. Wow, okay. No one unethical here. So you can never make an unethical or problematic decision. So, I get invited to talk at a lot of business schools, and I'm usually invited by the ethics professor, which is funny, but whenever I go to business schools, I ask to see the cases that they use to teach ethics to the students. And there are always these black and white cases, like, should you sell tainted baby formula? Should you pollute the river at night when no one's looking? Should you start a Ponzi scheme? I mean, I could get those right. What they don't focus on is this gray area. So I wrote a bunch of cases that focus on the gray area. And I'd like to give you a case today. Is that okay? I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. All right. That was unenthusiastic. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to give you one of the cases I give to the business school students. They get a week to work on it, but you're going to get 1 minute, so no one's going to hold it against you here. I'm going to show you what one company was doing, and I'm going to ask you a simple question. Is this ethical, not materially misleading, and something that you would approve of? Or the opposite, no, it's unethical, it's materially misleading, I would not approve it. Just a binary question. Okay, and this is actually a real case scenario. When I got out of prison, I didn't get many job offers, but the calls I did get were from hedge funds, and in particular short sellers. So these are hedge funds betting against companies. And they would hire me to go through a company's financial statements, other public documents, to try to find those Enron-like things, those misleading things that might be hiding a problem, because of course short sellers want to hide and then expose the problem. And so this is a case I worked on in early 2015. You don't have to be an accountant or finance person to get this. And it was a situation where I was reviewing the 2014 financials of a medium-sized independent oil and gas company, actually based in Houston, where I live. And this is what I found. Next slide, please. Okay. In the financial statements, the company's reporting of a huge increase in what are called economically recoverable reserves. Now, that's actually an accounting phrase, and it means the company's best estimate of the value of the oil and gas that's still in the ground that the company thinks that it could produce profitably. Okay, and oil and gas companies have to report this number every year. But to do so, they have to make a lot of assumptions, right? You have to assume how much oil and gas is in the ground, the cost of drilling, the cost of producing, the cost of transporting. Maybe most importantly, you have to assume what the price of the commodity is when you sell it. This company was showing that their number had gone way up, and that made a lot of sense, right? Because this company was using all the newest technologies. But here was the problem. The price of oil had dropped from $110 per barrel down to $50 per barrel. That should have caused some of the oil and gas in the ground to become uneconomic to produce. That should have pushed the number down. So I'm thinking technology's pushing it up, prices are pushing it down. I couldn't figure out which way it should be going, but I knew that it shouldn't have been going way up. So I did some digging, and this is what I found. For purposes of financial reporting, the company was assuming that the price of oil was $95 per barrel. But here's the problem. On December 31st, and when they released their financial statements, the price was only $50 per barrel. How big of a difference does that make, that one assumption? If the company had assumed $50 per barrel instead of $95, they would have had to lower their economically recoverable reserves by 61%. If you flip that on its head, that's like saying on a market value basis, they overstated reserves by more than 100%. It just so happens that this is the key metric that Wall Street looks at when they evaluate independent, medium-sized oil and gas companies. Go figure. And I'll tell you one other thing. I could tell you with a high degree of confidence that based on the market back then, if you had looked inside this company, at this company's own 10-year price forecast for oil, 95 wasn't even on the curve anymore. But they used 95 to report their financials. So, with that information, and I know it's limited information, how many of you would say that what the company did was ethical, not materially misleading, and something you would approve of. Okay. All right, I'm relieved since you like loopholes so much. But just to make sure you're participating, how many of you would say the opposite, that it's unethical, materially misleading, and you would not approve it? Okay, that's as unanimous as you get. Okay, that's good. But I left out one key piece of information. There's actually a rule that tells companies exactly what price to use. There's a rule in accounting, generally accepted accounting principles. Next slide, please. An SEC rule. It's been codified in GAAP, and it tells companies that you take the price of oil on the first day of each of the 12 preceding months and you average it. Turns out that in 2014, the price of oil was around $110 per barrel all year. Then it dropped down to 50. The average was 95. This company followed the rules. Every single energy company in America used 95. It was the rule. It was an SEC rule. It was GAAP. Now, you're allowed to depart from GAAP, right? Especially if it's to make your financial statements more fair. But no one did. And why would you? If you were the only company to use 50 instead of 95, it puts you at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis your peers. And if you depart from GAAP, even if it's to be more conservative, you have to file a report with the SEC. That's like sending them a party invitation. Hey, we departed from GAAP, come spend some time with us. So no one did it. And why would you? Okay, so it wasn't fair I didn't tell you that rule. But now that you know the rule, now that you know that every company used 95 because they were following the rule, if you worked in this company, how many of you would have objected? No one. That's really interesting. Okay, think about what just happened here. 2 minutes ago, when you evaluated the situation based on substance, you said it was unethical, that it was materially misleading, and it's something you wouldn't approve of. You felt strongly enough about it that you raised your hands in front of your peer group and you said, this is unethical, I will not do it. Somehow, in that 2 minutes, your brain erected a wall. It made you forget that you just said it was unethical and you wouldn't do it. And you're like, okay, I'm in. All because you saw a rule. So everyone here is willing to do the unethical thing simply because the rule allows it, I guess is what I'm saying. And no offense intended. Welcome to my world. This is meant to make you feel a little uncomfortable, to see how easy it was for your brain just to flip like that without even thought. Imagine if your brain has incentives. You had no incentive on this case. Imagine if your brain has the incentive. I'm not suggesting you do the wrong thing because there's a financial incentive or a promotion or some other recognition out there. Most people wouldn't do the wrong thing for money. But your brain's going to work extra hard to justify it, to rationalize it. And the key way our brains rationalize behavior that we might otherwise not approve of is by saying the rules allow it. So the challenge is not to convince people to do right versus wrong, which is what most ethics lectures are. The challenge is to convince people to be more self-aware, to even realize that they have an ethical decision to make. So it's not a case of finding the people that are breaking rules. We've got a lot of compliance people that find the people who are breaking rules. That's not the challenge. That's not where most disasters happen today. It's the people who are following the rules, but may not be thinking about the risk associated with it, may not be asking that reasonable person question. That's the challenge. And it's not a challenge you could teach, it's other than to teach yourself, to pause and ask that question. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide, then we're going to go to Q&A, so we have lots of time for Q&A. This is my most difficult slide. This is a picture of me on the day I was sentenced to prison. Literally, the judge handed down the sentence. He gave me 10 seconds to hug my wife. They took off my tie, I guess, so I couldn't commit suicide, and they chained me up. I spent the next 6 weeks in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison before they shipped me out to my permanent prison. This didn't happen until 2006. So Enron imploded in 2001. The legal process took a long time. So this is 5 years later, and a lot had happened over that 5 years. So going back to 2001, I was fired. The government seized almost all of my assets in a secret hearing in front of a judge, and demanded that I plead guilty. When I refused to plead guilty, they indicted me on over 70 felony counts of securities fraud. When I still refused to plead guilty, they indicted me on over 100 counts of securities fraud. When I still refused to plead guilty, they made up fake charges against my wife and indicted her, put her in handcuffs, perp walked her, and put her in prison until I pled guilty. Now I've been sentenced to prison, and I'm being let out in chains. I will tell you, notwithstanding all of that having happened and all of this time having passed, at this moment in time, I really still didn't understand what I had done wrong. I mean, when I was in court, I had to make a statement, so I sort of made the perfunctory, obligatory, short statement that I was sorry. But if the judge had given me more than a minute to talk, I probably would have ended up pounding on the desk saying, but damn it, I don't understand what's going on here. I was doing exactly what a good CFO should do. I followed the rules. All my deals were approved. I was a hero. How could you be sending me to prison? How could you even be angry with me? I mean, in my head and my heart, I'm really embarrassed to say, but in my head and my heart at this moment in time, I really didn't understand what I had done wrong. It wasn't until about a year later that I finally came to understand that I was a problem and that this wasn't happening to me, but rather that I was the cause of the problem. And I wanted to tell you the story of how that happened. It's kind of a religious story. I'm not a very religious person. I'm Jewish and I practice, but I'm not very religious, and I didn't have a big religious awakening in prison that some inmates have, but it's a religious story nonetheless, and so I thought I'd tell you about it. In prison, there's always a prison chaplain, but it's rarely a rabbi. And in fact, I was in prison in Louisiana, and I was the only Jewish inmate, so they would allow once a month for 1 hour, a rabbi to come visit me. And so this rabbi is very serious, looking rabbi, sort of the stereotypical rabbi you'd see in a movie with the black suit and the hat and the long beard and the curls. He'd come up from New Orleans to visit me in prison. And we didn't do a lot of praying and things like that. We would just talk. And I guess I would describe these conversations, I guess the fairest way to describe it is me whining. And every month it was the same thing. I would say, I don't understand what's happened here. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was helping people. And yet I've caused all of this harm, and now I'm one of the most hated people in America. I feel like I live in a bizarro world. Everything's backwards. And every month, month after month, this rabbi would just look at me, stern face, and nod. And he wouldn't say anything. And I'll tell you, after about 10 months of this, it kind of pissed me off. And I finally said to him, look, if you're not going to say anything, I wonder if there's anything that the rabbis have ever written that I might read that might help me work through this and understand this. And this serious rabbi who never smiled looks at me, and he bursts out laughing in my face, and which is not the reaction I expected. And he said, Andy, the rabbis have been writing about exactly this issue for the last 1,400 years. So the next time he came, he brought me some of these writings. And just a quick aside, little Judaism primer. In Judaism, we have something called the Talmud, which is basically an aggregation of all of the opinions that have been written by the most learned, revered, respected rabbis. So we don't have like a pope in Judaism. It's more like there's a supreme court of these rabbis. And other rabbis and lay people can pose questions to this group, and then the rabbis debate. And these debates typically will go on 3, 4, 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, because they almost never reach agreement, they agree to stop debating and they write a majority opinion and a minority opinion, which, by the way, is where our Supreme Court gets that structure of majority and minority opinions. And all of these opinions together are called the Talmud. They're meant to be a resource for people to consult so that hopefully they can conduct themselves better in life. Sorry for that aside. But the next time he came, he brought some of these writings. And I want to tell you about the one that changed my life, and not to sound overly dramatic, in some ways saved my life. There was a case hundreds of years ago where a rabbi posed this question to this court of rabbis. He said, in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, he said, we believe there are 613 commandments. 612 commandments are a list of everything that God requires us to do and everything that God prohibits us from doing. But then there's one last commandment that says only just the phrase, be holy. The rabbi asked, he said, if a person were to follow the first 612 commandments to the letter of the law, do every single thing that God requires of him, and never do anything that God prohibits, wouldn't he by definition already be holy? And if so, why is this extra commandment here? What does it mean? And what was really interesting was that this court of rabbis, which almost never would reach consensus on any issue, unanimously agreed on the answer to this question. They said a person could follow the first 612 commandments to the letter of the law and still be a completely unholy person. They even came up with a phrase in Hebrew to describe it, which roughly translates, a reprehensible and disgusting person within the confines of the law. They said a person can follow all the laws technically and be completely reprehensible and disgusting. They said, unless he also considers the spirit of the law. And that's what they said that last commandment means, be holy, that you have to stop and consider the reason for the law, the spirit of the law, the purpose of the law. And I'll tell you, when I read this, I'm not a particularly emotional person, but I cried because I realized that they were writing about me, that I was that reprehensible and disgusting person. That was a tough day for me, but also one that I think ultimately was very helpful. It was really interesting in reading the commentary from these rabbis because they really understood human nature. They said, look, people know what they want. We all know what we want, consciously, sometimes subconsciously. And people are really creative. And they said, no matter how many commandments exist, no matter how many laws they write to put on top of the commandments, people are always going to be able to find ways to get around those rules, to get what they want. Loopholes. They're writing about loopholes. Hundreds and hundreds, a millennium ago. And then they said, especially in business, they made a distinction. They said, when you're in this gray area, when you're finding ways to exploit the rules, it happens more in business because there's money at stake. Okay, and your brain works differently when money's at stake. And they said, when you're in this gray area, when you're finding those loopholes, there is a greater chance that harm will be caused. So they wanted people to stop and think about what they were doing. What's interesting is they didn't say you have to just follow the spirit of the law. They didn't say that. They said you have to consider the spirit of the law. Pause. So it's like instead of putting up a red stoplight saying don't do this, they put in a speed bump. And they said, stop and think about this. When you're making that decision, you might be in a critical point where what you do can harm other people. This is what I didn't do. they were writing about me. So I'm gonna, because I've run out of time, I'm gonna stop here and say, first, thank you for your time, but also wish you some speed bumps in life. You're in a very challenging industry with a lot of complexity, ambiguity in the laws and rules, with a lot of nonsensical rules and laws, and very often you're operating in areas where rules and laws don't exist yet. There's more risk there than you realize. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying maybe take a little longer to stop and think, because like me, hopefully not like me, your actions can have consequences that aren't readily apparent. So thank you again. Okay, I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, come on, you can't be the only group that's never asked me a question.
Andy, thanks for the talk. Question: You mentioned the board of directors and everyone else that were making, or approving the decisions that you were making. Your board of directors was made up of business elite, the former head of the FTC, former dean of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, some pretty important people. What were their reactions after all this happened? Any communication with them, anything that they had to go through, or were they pretty much out of the mix after all of this happened?
Okay, that's a great question. I get asked a question about sort of where was the board during all of this a lot, because I was a 37-year-old CFO, totally unqualified for the position, and overly aggressive, and what most people would say unethical or lacking ethics. And so where was the board? What were they doing? If you're in a big company, a big public company, you can't do any of these deals without board approval. So what were they thinking? That's a good question. And you're right, our board was made up of very serious people. I mean, it wasn't a window dressing board or a political board. I mean, the chairman of the audit committee was a former dean of Stanford Business School and chair emeritus of Stanford's accounting department. The chair of the finance committee ran one of the largest finance companies in America. The chair of the executive committee ran one of the largest independent energy companies in America. We had the former chairwoman of the FTC on the board. I mean, this was a high-powered, a lot of brain power on this board. So what were they thinking when they were approving this? I'll tell you one story which I think maybe sums it up, and maybe will scare you. I told you that what I did was that I made Enron look financially healthy when it really wasn't. And to give you an idea of the magnitude of this activity, Enron was rated BBB+ or equivalent by all the major credit rating agencies, so kind of a solid investment grade. But internally at Enron, I thought our true credit profile looked more like a BB-. Okay, and I actually had a spreadsheet that calculated this. And if my story isn't already embarrassing enough, it was called the truth spreadsheet. Literally, it was an Excel spreadsheet. It was the word truth.xls. And this is what it looked like. In the left-hand column, you had the key ratios that the rating agencies looked at, like debt to cap, funds flow coverage, et cetera. And then in the next column, we took the published financial numbers from the published financial statements, and we put them in the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet would calculate the ratios. And then on the bottom, we had a formula that, based on the rating agency guidelines, would calculate the implied rating. So based on the public numbers, BBB+. And then we had a column for every single deal that we did. Okay, and you could see what each column, what each deal did, because you could look and you could see how the ratios changed. So you could see this deal generated a few pennies of EPS, or this deal moved debt off balance sheet, or this deal created the appearance of funds flow from operations. And you could see how the ratios and the ratings change. And you move all the way out to the right-hand side, down on the bottom, BB-, the truth spreadsheet. I'm so proud of this that I decided I was going to show it to the board of directors. Now, I knew they knew what I did had impact because they approved every one of my deals and they understood why they were approving it, but I didn't think that they fully appreciated the total impact of Andy Fastow. And I wanted them to appreciate me more. So at one of the board meetings, I brought this truth spreadsheet and I handed it out to all the directors, and all the directors sitting around the giant conference table in the boardroom on the 50th floor of the Enron Tower in Houston, and they're all looking down at the truth spreadsheet. And no one's saying a word. No one's looking up, no one's talking, and a minute goes by, 2 minutes goes by. You can imagine how long that felt if you're sitting in a boardroom with the directors and no one's saying anything or looking up. And then all of a sudden, the chairman of the finance committee looks up at me, he points at me and he says, "Fastow, you are an effing genius." The first thing that went in through my head was, well, that's an understatement, but which was a whole nother set of problems, by the way. What could they have been thinking? You know, what I just described to you today, if anyone were to see it today, they'd say, why did it take them so long to prosecute at Enron? You know, one piece of evidence, this is the proof of fraud right here. Why did it take so long? How could we be talking about that as a piece of evidence you could convict everyone with, yet the board's looking at it thinking, I'm an effing genius. It's how our brains work. How are directors evaluated? Pretty much by the stock price of the company, right? They want to be directors of companies where the value keeps going up. So they're thinking, we need to do things that are good for the company. This is good for the shareholders. When anyone looks at the spreadsheet I described to you, one thing jumps out clearly. You don't have to be able to do complicated math to figure this out. That spreadsheet tells you exactly how many shares of Enron stock that we did not have to issue that otherwise would have been dilutive because of the deals on that piece of paper. Billions of dollars worth of Enron stock did not have to be issued and dilute current shareholders. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you're a director and your brain's telling you the objective we want to get to is a higher stock price, you do not want to dilute. So you look at this and you say, that's billions of dollars of value added, not billions of dollars of fraud. Now it turns out that ultimately it was fraud. But these are smart guys sitting in a room looking at that same piece of paper that we'd now say proof of fraud, thinking genius. No one in that room asked this question. And it should have been me before I even went in with the piece of paper. If the outside world were to see this or create their own version of the truth spreadsheet, what would happen to our company? It would have been a swarm of cockroaches. And ultimately, that's what happened. Enron went bankrupt essentially because it lost its credit rating, because the outside world started focusing on one deal, and it led them to question all the other deals. End of credit rating, company becomes insolvent overnight. That was the end. It was right there. Everyone had been looking at it, but we didn't see the risk. Again, it's not a question. I hate using the word ethics because I could throw out any number of topics and half of you will say ethical, half of you will say unethical. We won't agree on ethics, but what we can agree on is risk, right? The risk was there staring us in the face, but we didn't see it because our brains were telling us all these deals have been approved. If anyone comes back and questions them, we'll just sit them down with the attorneys. We'll sit them down with the accountants. No problem. Just like Hillary Clinton. It's been approved. And we ended up with Donald Trump. Okay, hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Andy, listening to everything that you've said, I'm curious because it comes across as you didn't ever think it was something that you should not question because everyone was approving it. Knowing what you know now, would you go back and change the decisions that you made? And would have you have spoken up and said, this isn't the right thing, or I think we can come to a different solution?
If I've been coming across as trying to justify what I did because everyone approved it, it's just the opposite, okay? What I've been trying to convey is that notwithstanding that they were approved, I should have been asking other questions. Would a reasonable person under normal circumstances behave this way, for example? So again, I was trying to put you in my head in the year 2000, because I'm sure there are some people in this room who maybe have been involved in a decision where they've maybe felt queasy about it. Don't raise your hands. Maybe felt queasy about it, but the answer has been, but it's been approved by the attorneys. It's been approved by the accountants. It's okay. What I'm suggesting is when that happens, there are still questions that need to be asked that I failed to ask, which is why I consider myself the person most responsible for Enron's failure, because I didn't ask those questions. So look, a precondition for even making a decision is that it's approved by the outside experts. That's just the precondition. And I treated that precondition as the final answer. After the precondition, there need to be other questions asked, which I failed to ask, which we didn't ask at Enron. Did I answer your question? Okay.
So I see a lot of gray area, not only happening in specific companies, but really entire industries. And I'm going to pick on the airlines because I fly a lot and it's been awful in the last 18 months. Fewer routes, more delays, fewer staff. It's just been awful. And yet when I look at their 10Ks and other financial reports, boy, they're profitable. A lot of treasury stock coming through, raising that stock price up. You see the non-operating income just through the roof. It's actually more than they make operating as an airline, so they're a quasi-hedge fund at this point. What can you do as an individual or even as a business who relies on services? I can't stop flying for my job, but I want to do something about this and improve these, they're operating legally, but boy, oh boy, does it stink having to get on an airline right now. What can I do as an individual or business to really push the envelope to get them out of those gray areas and to affect true change, to make.
What can you do? What can you do as an individual to affect a public company moving out of the gray areas?
Exactly. And I feel like there's nothing at this point.
That's a question I've never been asked before. I don't think there's a lot you can do. I think you can sell this, what they would say is, if you don't like what we're doing, sell the stock. You can vote with your feet. Look, short sellers are a painful group of people to deal with, but they provide a very valuable service, which is, it's a market check, if you will, on companies that push too far into the gray area. So I would say invest in a hedge fund that shorts companies, I guess, if you're, and they do most of the police work these days. Unfortunately, more companies don't worry about short sellers as much as they should. But the short sellers keep getting smarter and smarter, and but it's an arms race. Look, you have an entire industry of bankers and accountants and attorneys, and all they do is help companies find ways to juice the financials. And then you have on the other side the government to some degree with the SEC or federal prosecutors, but really short sellers. Trying to expose that behavior. So I don't see it changing. I don't see how one individual can change it.
Chris, I'm going to need a raise to help invest in some hedge funds here. So if you can, we'll talk about that after.
It's not the most efficient way to solve the problem, but the hedge funds do provide a very valuable service. Otherwise, it would be even further out of control.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm a business analytics professor at the University of Akron, and one of the issues that I have is when you're presenting students, you're basically saying there's a business ethics issue in here, here's a case. But when we're thinking about this gray area, do you have any advice, whether it's for CFOs, top management, just business people? How do you recognize when you're in the gray area? Any personal advice?
That's a great question, and I do a bit of consulting with boards as well, and we spend a lot of time talking about different things they could be doing that perhaps they're not already doing to try to avoid these types of situations. And so, you know, I've got a list of 20 things, but I'll give you 2 that I think are real simple fixes. The first is, and this could be done at the board level, but it could be done at every operating group level. Add a person whose only job is to challenge what you're doing. You know, be a designated pain in the butt, okay? And here's why. Because while we may try to build corporate cultures to encourage people to dissent and challenge and disagree, people understand intuitively that there's limits to doing that. That if they disagree too much or too vehemently, it might hurt their career, it might hurt their reputation. They might be deemed as, oh, that guy's maybe a potential whistleblower or troublemaker. We don't want him on our team. So people don't really speak up. Doesn't matter how many open door policies you have and all that, right? But if you have a designated person whose only job is to do that, then everyone knows that guy's gonna do it. And they don't get mad at that person. So have the designated pain in the butt guy everywhere. And the second thing I'll give you, not to be, but this is a simple one to be able to go through with a big group, is this. Every director, and if not every executive, should be asking the question anytime they're making an important decision. If this were a private company that I owned, would I make the same decision? And it turns out that there are a lot of reasons why private companies and public companies might make different decisions with the same set of facts, and that's understandable. But it will precipitate a conversation as to why. So, for example, is the reason we're doing this just to make our financials look better? And is that something that's in the best long-term interest of the company? If this were a company I wanted to leave to my grandchildren, would I want to do this? And it will precipitate a different type of discussion at the board level. And the feedback I get from directors is that one question fundamentally changed the dynamics on their boards. It seems simple, it seems obvious, but so I would recommend those 2 things as a starting point. The designated a-hole and the private company question. Anyone else?
Okay, there we go. Man, I have a 2-part question. One, do you think Sarbanes-Oxley addressed it? Do you think it did what it needed to try and force the rudder? And then secondarily, do you have any opinion on publicly traded quarterly earnings, EPS, cadence? Is it too much reporting, too little reporting? Is there conflict in that that desire to constantly hit EPS, and is there anything in there after the Sarbanes-Oxley comment that you'd like to comment on?
Okay, those are really complicated questions. Good questions, Christian. Sarbanes-Oxley. We could debate all day long whether Sarbanes-Oxley was a worthwhile piece of legislation or not, but what I can tell you as a fact is it was a piece of legislation that was put in place supposedly as a reaction to Enron that did nothing to address the problems that caused Enron's failure. So Sarbanes-Oxley is really, I'm oversimplifying, legislation that creates mechanisms and requirements to make sure everyone is paying attention. Because the initial theme that came out of Enron was, oh, the board of directors weren't paying attention, the senior management didn't know what was going on. You know, directors were saying crazy stuff like, oh, I had jet lag and I fell asleep at that meeting, so I don't really remember. You know, I mean, but the reality is they knew what was going on. Everything was approved internally and externally. So they created this legislation with this, you know, checklist of things companies have to do to ensure people are paying attention. I think the biggest beneficiaries of that are accounting firms, not companies. I think it's a pretty big cost to impose, especially on small and medium-sized companies. And I'm not sure it makes them any more attentive than they already were. And in fact, it might actually be counter-effective, because by having this paper trail now, it creates a way for senior managers and directors to protect themselves from liability. So you've actually maybe reduced the ability to go after the top guys, which might be a good way to otherwise cause them to behave better. So I'm not a big fan of Sarbanes-Oxley. It was created under false pretense, if you will. And I'm not sure I see the benefit, especially compared to the cost. The second part of your question was just about rules in general. Look, I don't think, like the rabbis said, no matter how many commandments there are, no matter how many rules there are, people will find ways to get around them. People are creative. And quite frankly, I think the private market is usually a little more creative and faster than government regulators. So, you know, at Enron, when they'd close a loophole by changing an accounting rule, we didn't think that was a bad thing. You know why? Because we prided ourselves on being the company that would be the first to figure out a way around the new regulations, which would give us a competitive advantage vis-a-vis every other company. I still get excited when I talk about this. I'm like a recovering alcoholic. It's like I get excited thinking about these deals, and I have to tell myself, no, bad. So I don't think you're gonna regulate this behavior out of existence. It's not business behavior that I'm talking about. It's human nature, right? I mean, I'm sure people can think about examples in their private lives where maybe they've seen other people, or maybe themselves have fudged it a little. You know, we use different terms in life, or we found ways around the rules and we've used rationalizations to justify behavior that otherwise would be unacceptable. So I don't think you're going to solve it with more rules. You know, ironically, the best way to police companies might be to only have one rule. You have to publish true financial statements, but don't define true. Let it litigate out in court. I think companies use the rules as protection. If you could say, look, the auditors approved it, the attorneys approved it, you can't sue me over it, or you can't win a suit over it. And if Enron, if I hadn't gone as far as I had gone doing these misleading transactions, it would have been very difficult to sue the company or prosecute anyone involved. Yes.
Thank you. I very much appreciate this talk today. My question is, when you're doing the consulting work for other companies, do you ever feel an obligation to say to someone maybe above that, hey, this is not a good thing. This is leading down a really very bad path, and I would suggest that you don't go this direction. And are you under any legal obligation, if you see things that are not appropriate, to report them anywhere?
Should I say that to the short sellers or to the companies? Well, if I'm hired by the companies, I don't have any legal obligation to say that to them. They don't often bring me in to actually evaluate the companies themselves to identify risk areas. Actually, you know, when I was in prison, I didn't plan to do public speaking when I got out of prison. It was really just an accident. Someone invited me to talk, and I was like, I didn't have anything else to do. So I went and talked. But what I had hoped to do was consult with boards of directors and go in and identify Enron-like things, either specific accounting that they had done or behaviors that they were engaged in, and to help them identify risks so that they could manage their companies better. And that was not a business model that could sell. Directors didn't want outsiders coming in to help them identify risks. And I'm not exactly sure why, and I don't want to sound too cynical, but a couple of directors pulled me aside and they said, we really need this, but we're not going to do it because it might increase our liability. That's why I then began encouraging them to just add an additional board member, the designated pain in the butt guy, to do that job on a permanent basis for them. And some have done that to their credit. And the feedback I get from them is it makes their board meetings longer, but it's worthwhile. So I think, is that good? Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone. Appreciate being here.